Cool. Okay, so for those of you who don't work in my office, I'm Melanie Bhatti. I work in Educational Technology Services, and I organize this series of tech talks. This is the second to last one of the semester, so we have one more 3 weeks from today, which is also about virtual reality. So if that's part of why you were interested in being here, come check it out on the 24th, next 3 Tuesdays from today. It's about the Women in Science, History of Women in Science virtual reality project that's ongoing through digital scholarship here. And some students have been working on a digital virtual reality reconstruction of the science labs in Dalton Hall, and they're going to talk about their project. So I think it should be really interesting, and I don't really know anything about it, so I'm excited about that. This is also related to virtual reality and pedagogy and other things, and that's sort of what that sort of intersection of tech and pedagogy is what we tend to cover at these talks. If you haven't already signed in on the sheet, either in the back or by the coffee, it would be great if you could do that before you leave, just so that we know who's here and so that we can tailor our future events to your interests and be in touch with you. We have a newsletter that we send out that you can opt into on that sign-in sheet, and that way you can find out about future tech talks and other things that we do as a group. And I think those are my only housekeeping notes. So I'll turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you. So there are actually 3 of us presenting. I'm Jenny Spohrer. I'm the Director of Educational Technology Services.
I'm Strunk. I'm the Associate Director of Praxis and Civic Engagement at Palak.
Hi, my name is Palak Bhandari. I am an educational technologist as well, and I'm the field supervisor for the course that we're about to talk about.
That's right. I'm the Faculty Director, and then Kelly
I'm
is
field coordinator.
the Praxis person, as we know of. So just real quick, since we're a small group, do you guys want to introduce yourselves just so we don't know each other?
Charles and I are both at Haverford, instructional technology specialists.
Digital media specialist. We're in Horizon.
Cool.
And Alex Savick.
And Charles here.
Excellent, excellent. Well,
I'm Beth Seltzer, an educational technologist.
oh, sorry. We knew who Beth was.
we know. Yeah.
So, and somewhat selfishly, I would say that, hang on, I can't think and do this at the same time. So Kelly and Palak and I decided to do this in part to kind of gather our own thinking around this. And this is sort of a draft presentation of something we're going to do at the Blended Learning Conference and perhaps in other venues. So thank you all for bearing with us and giving feedback. I actually have copies of our syllabus, which is also kind of still a work in progress. Less work in progress than it was at the beginning of the year. But we've been, in the spirit of emerging technologies, we've been trying things out, taking away what doesn't work, what does, building on what does. So this is kind of a snapshot of where we are right now. And one of the things to say is this was an experiment of sorts, and we are only partway through. So we're now in week 9,
Yeah.
Right, of 14. So the students are currently doing their projects, and you'll see on the syllabus kind of where they are and where they are sort of in our intellectual journey as well. So just to start us off, sort of why experiential learning. And I would say part of the impetus for this talk came from Palak and I sat in on a webinar one day that was all about creating experiential learning opportunities with AR and VR technology. And we thought, great, there are kids that are out there that are working with AR, VR technology, and that was not it at all. It was really about creating AR, VR simulations that students would engage with in their classes in some way, which is all fine and dandy, but that is definitely not how we defined experiential learning. So we thought, okay, well, let's talk a little bit about that. And sort of all of this came about based on a relationship with Pearson through an alum at Bryn Mawr, and this will be a bit of a pattern. We had worked at Pearson. Pearson was getting into AR, VR technology. When the HoloLens, Microsoft HoloLens came out, there were only developmental copies available. Pearson got some through an agreement with Microsoft. Pearson was looking for campus partners who would help them test And really, since this was such cutting edge technology, think about what we might develop for the higher education market. And so we became part of that. And the idea was we would show these devices to faculty and staff, talk about some ideas, maybe show a few prototypes. They had a hollow chemistry app that they were developing that we would demonstrate for our students and faculty and just get lots of feedback. And kind of one of the great unknowns was what would it take to make these things classroom ready, right? These were still prototypical devices. But we had the HoloLenses, and we could do what we wanted with them in between these demos. And so I thought, well, why don't we put them in the hands of students who are very interested and who are the ones really, none of this stuff is off the shelf. Well, back up a little bit. Palak and I are educational technologists. Typically, I would say what we do is help faculty integrate technology into the classroom. But that technology is usually very classroom ready, right? It's more things like PowerPoint or online quizzes or things that have been around, things that have a track record, things that we know work reasonably well. This was not that, and certainly not a year ago, 2 years ago when we were first approached by Pearson. So, there weren't many real classroom opportunities to use this yet because there really wasn't much that you could do with them in a class. And we thought, well, why not make, since everyone's projecting that these technologies will be as ubiquitous as iPhones are today in several years, when our students are out developing, why not put them in the students' hands and see what they come up with? So that's sort of where the first idea came from. And so there's a couple ways that one could go about doing this. An external internship might be one way. We could find opportunities for students to go and learn about how people are working with AR, VR technologies outside of campus. At the time, those are few and far between because, again, this is cutting edge technology. And also there's some downsides to that, I think. The learning is happening off campus. So we can't sort of encapsulate it in good practices and things like that we'll talk about in a minute. But also it means that we wouldn't have the chance to develop that knowledge either. Palak and I are not, nor is Kelly, an AR/VR specialist. And so, another idea is having an internal internship where the students are working with us and we can help we learn alongside of them. And I think that's where we first went with this. And we had several iterations of internships. We had a winter break or Wintern extravaganza. There was a competition to develop educational simulations, AR/VR simulations, that really were grounded, trying to get from the sort of bright, shiny new object to actual lesson plans that involved thematically new kinds of technology. And so we brought some students in, we had them work with the devices, and in 15 days they came up with an app that they put into this competition. It was actually a device to teach students about musical instruments and the different instruments in the orchestra, and to be able to look at them, to be able to kind of hear how they were played, thinking about a way of broadening who has access to these kinds of instruments or knows about them. We had some summer interns who did this over a longer period of time, and then we had one student who couldn't do it over the summer and did it over the fall. And those students, they did a Holo Museum app. One student did a physics simulation. So lots of different things that they've been working on. And then our other thought was something called a Praxis course. And I'm going to turn it over to Kelly, who will explain what this strange animal is.
Yes. So, has anyone heard of Praxis in this room? Heard of it? Maybe you better have. You have heard of it though?
I would need a refresher after this.
Yeah. So at Bryn Mawr we have a program called Praxis, which is our community-based learning program. Frequently, I get phone calls about the Praxis test for educators, but that's not what we do. So there are 3 kinds of Praxis courses here. Praxis 1 and 2 courses are tied to our departmental courses. So you have, for example, an introduction to sociology class that has some kind of field component to inform the work of the class in some way. The other kind of class that we have then is the Praxis Independent Study, or in the case of this class, the Praxis Seminar. So it's a newer model that we're testing out, where students will have a single faculty, multiple students will have a single faculty advisor. Oftentimes they're in different field placements, but in this case they were in the same field placement, so it worked a little bit differently than the seminar courses that we're testing out in other ways. But Praxis Independent Study generally is when a single student and a single faculty advisor and a single field site work together to develop a course with an 8 to 10 hour a week field placement and academic content that focuses around that field work. So a student who wants to explore a certain topic deeper and they can identify how to do that in the context of a field placement will develop a Praxis Independent Study course, spending the majority of the work of the course in the field, and then reflecting back on that experience with a faculty advisor and doing traditional academic assignments related to readings that they're doing around what they're seeing in the field. So Praxis is part of the Civic Engagement Office. The Civic Engagement Office, we're the curricular side of the Civic Engagement Office. The Civic Engagement Office also has our volunteer programs and other kinds of opportunities along the civic engagement continuum, from volunteering to activism. And then civic engagement is part of the Leadership, Innovation, and Liberal Arts Center, or LILAC, which is the hub at this point for all experiential learning programming.
So one thing to note on both, we've shown you the Praxis website here, main webpage, and then LILAC's main webpage, and experiential learning really is kind of front and center to what they do. So why experiential learning? And this is also why I was thinking, hey, we have these devices, let's see what students can learn by doing something with them. There's a large body of research talking about efficacy and engaging students and supporting things like retention and stuff like that, but also in really helping students to sort of improving learning outcomes in the sense of mastery of disciplinary types of thinking or concepts or skills that you want them to develop, and also the sort of critical thinking, communication, sort of more liberal arts general types of skills. And so this wasn't just a sort of, hey, let's throw this out there. This was actually, we were really thinking that this would be a very good learning experience for our students. And just to kind of point you to George D. Kuh's, Kuh? Okay. I learned German at one point, so I have a hard time with things that could be that. George Kuh's high impact practices, and he basically, using a survey of something called NESI, which is a national survey of student engagement, he was kind of looking around and seeing what are the things that engage students more at an institutional level and in terms of retention and things like that. But these were also things that in the reporting students were articulating as having real meaningful, life-changing even sort of impact on them, and why they were in college and what they found, like years later when you'd survey them, this is what they would say were most relevant to them. Hey Jeff, come on in. Okay. And so really the Praxis course that we've developed, and maybe any Praxis course, kind of hits a lot of these things, right? There's the service, community-based learning is actually one of the a high-impact practice. Internships, also high-impact practice. And then the undergraduate research, collaborative assignments and processes, projects, and then the learning communities. And all of these things are kind of built into a course that's like this. And we've also been very mindful, I think, in trying to develop those things and make sure that those things are in there. So, some worries. When I've gone out and we've talked to people, we presented at a national conference about sort of what we're doing, and people say, oh, well, we don't have enough technical expertise. I think Palak has been telling me this from the very beginning, and I've been saying it's okay, the students have technical expertise. And actually, this has been less of an issue than you might think, especially when you're talking about AR, VR technology, because the development for these devices happens in something called Unity, which is a game development environment or engine. One can develop on Unity without computer science skills of any kind. I wouldn't recommend it. We find it's best if folks have had some intro, at least. Palak and I, of course, don't have an intro. Well, Palak does, actually. I don't. No, she won't own it.
One class freshman year. So
There you go. More than I do. But and I will say that the students work very effectively in groups, and groups, I think, of someone who has a little bit more tech, and certainly the sort of CS troubleshooting, kind of I'm looking at the code and how do I find out where the mistake is. That would be very helpful if you had them in groups, but not everybody needs to have that. And people certainly develop the skills they need as they go. I think what Palak and I bring to the table is project management, design thinking, those sorts of how to help students get from ideas that they're having to sort of reality. And that's something that we try to both model and give them training in. Another sort of thing, people are like, oh, the funding, the equipment, Actually, with the mobile devices now, these technologies are getting cheaper and cheaper. So like a Google Cardboard is $15, I think. We've got several of those. Even the HoloLens that we have, which was given to us, is about $3,000, $5,000. So, we've got one of them, and they port to that one and take turns with it. Some of the bigger things like the hives and things like that, you can get really expensive and big, but those have limitations. You can't walk away from it because it's tethered to a high-powered computer. So when you look at what people are doing in the field, especially in a museum context, you're thinking smaller and cheaper, right? And also, when you start thinking about applications, this question of what kind of equipment and do we have the funding and everything, this is the kind of thing that people in the field are thinking about. So these are the kinds of questions that it's really good for students to engage with. Yes, we could do all this stuff, but how practical is that? How practical is that if we want people who are, under the age of 12 to be using these devices? Do we really want to give them this really high-powered, but very temperamental device, right? And another question that gets raised around things like this is this vocational training? Should we be doing this at a liberal arts college? What is it? And again, I would say, I think we, all three of us, very vehemently say no, in part because, again, there is this sort of academic component. There is this thinking about what are these technologies doing, and kind of a critical thinking about what they enable us to do, what maybe scary things they enable us to do, what this means for being a spectator or an author or a participant, what it means to be in a museum. So we're directly engaging with these kinds of critical, sort of theoretical, intellectual questions. And then also what's really interesting about doing this in the context of a museum studies course is this is exactly the question that the museum professionals and cultural institutions are grappling with. Should we be doing this? Why should we be doing this? And so the students have had we did a field trip out to Franklin Institute, and this was one of the things that they talked very eloquently about. Why technology? What do we do with it? What does it mean?
So, about the course. This is the part where I talk, apparently.
We're doing interpretive dance.
Yeah, the earlier iteration of the slide was Palak talks or she does an interpretive dance, so I filled it in very quickly. So for those of you that have syllabi sort of sitting next to you, if you don't, there's a copy at the end of the back table over there. This course is a history of art course that is looking at AR and VR applications of, essentially looking at museum studies and AR and VR applications of them. So how this course is set up is basically we have our students going to Jenny, who's our faculty member for the course, once a week, and they're doing, essentially they're meeting for an hour and a half and looking at literature regarding and relating to different sort of concepts and theories in and ideas of augmented and virtual reality. So we started them off looking at the history of what augmented and what virtual means, and now they're starting to talk about accessibility and sort of the ability to design and create technologies that are actually accessible for more than just the standard user. So that's a conversation that they've been grappling with recently. So that happens once a week, and then for about 8 hours or so, they are doing what's called fieldwork. So one shameless advantage that we have in our fieldwork is that our students don't necessarily need to be, they only need to be on campus in order to do the fieldwork. So they're not having to travel anywhere else to use these technologies. They can just come to our offices and come to a computer lab and work on their projects. So we have fieldwork where they'll come in, they'll start working on their projects, and I'll be there to sort of help them talk through their projects, to help them think about, what issues are they grappling with, and how does this, how might their projects look like from a user perspective. So like Jenny was saying earlier, a lot of the sort of value adds that we bring to the table are thinking about these questions of, that are outside of just designing a project and designing a product in some ways. And since, you associate the idea of, AR and VR technologies with these STEM and CS related fields, in particular, we're also providing that perspective and saying, okay, well, how are you having a user who might be in this museum exhibition or installation for the first time, in your sort of project for the first time, how are they constructing it and conceptualizing it? So let me backtrack one step and say that throughout the semester, the goal of the students' goal has been work in small project teams to develop a AR, VR museum installation or exhibition or
thing
they're
referring
basically.
to it now. We had a long conversation about what exactly like application means versus installation versus exhibition versus game, right? And what is it exactly that they were developing? And one of them said that she just tells people she's doing a VR thing because she can't quite pin it down yet.
How many students are in the class?
So there's 6 total students, and they are coming from backgrounds of CS, growth and structure of cities, and political science, and not including like double majors and minors and whatnot. So there's already a base in terms of a variety, like a diverse base of students, but there are students all of our students have come in with some coding experience. I guess thinking about the in-class content, one of the questions that we had was how do we sort of draw from an emerging base of literature, right? So there's not that much stuff out there about what our students are conceptualizing of as augmented reality, where it's this pair of goggles or glasses that you're putting on and seeing, either an isolated environment or you're seeing reality with. So we also were struggling a bit to try and figure out, what do we talk about in a way that it connects to this idea, even considering that ideas of sort of virtual and augmented have evolved over time. And then similarly in our fieldwork, we're also grappling with questions of how do we help our students when we don't have that technical base or that technical knowledge. And we found that these project management and design thinking sort of areas of expertise that we have are pretty valuable because they help our students consider questions that they might not have considered before. So like in fieldwork yesterday, we had our students going, oh wait, the app that we built, which is essentially a scavenger hunt, it might not be the best thing for someone who suffers from color blindness. How do we resolve that issue, and how do we, make it so it's actually more accessible? We've had students who are building a augmented reality app that shows and pops up tweets in sort of midair around you when you put this app on. And so one of the questions was, how do you control the speed of these tweets so that someone can actually read them as opposed to them just flying around you? So there's questions like these that we're able to engage our students in. And one of the other things that we're also being really deliberate about is actually incorporating what we have at Bryn Mawr, which is called the Digital Competencies Initiative, which focuses on our students sort of developing and expanding on skills that they may already have, utilized, but we're really being deliberate about how they're developing the language to talk about these skills. So some of the skills, some of the digital competencies that our students are coming up with or utilizing rather are, algorithmic thinking and coding, design thinking, project management. There's probably another few that I'm missing.
Troubleshooting.
Oh yeah, troubleshooting. Pretty big one. So they're also developing these the language to talk about these competencies as they're going out through the course, and we're also, making sure that we provide an introduction to these competencies at the beginning of the semester, but then also sort of provide them the opportunity to reflect and articulate the skills that they've learned throughout the semester in an end of semester workshop and also in our end of semester Praxis poster presentations, which we're also innovating in some ways on those because how our Praxis program has been set up traditionally has been that our students at the end of the semester will do a traditional poster and they will talk about their Praxis sort of experience, whether that was an independent study or sort of a cohort course like ours or any variation of the Praxis programs. So we decided to get a little bit innovative and I think Kelly also has been a huge supporter of this idea and I would also say the driver of this idea. We've started to have our students actually think about how they can create digital posters. So what would you present on a digital poster versus physical poster? And knowing that you have this ability to be in a digital medium, how can you incorporate different components of your app into a poster, or what are you defining as a poster that you can use to present to someone else? So it's also an opportunity for them to talk about their digital competencies, but also apply some other ones as they're developing a digital poster.
It's also interesting too, because I think
Yes.
it raised the question of what are the affordances of a poster, but also what are the limitations, right? If you put something that is a web page, then people can click, and then are they, if the point is to engage you in conversation, is that distracting? Is it a good thing? Unfortunately, I cannot click on digital competencies to link to our website. But
All right.
well, I will pass it on. So this is maybe less relevant to those in this particular room right now, but one of the things we wanted to do is give a plug for the Bryn Mawr has some digital Bryn Mawr seed grants, and these are to support our blended learning initiative, which is about incorporating technology into pedagogy and teaching and learning, but also into research, digital scholarship, and then the development of opportunities for students to develop digital competencies. And so you can see where a course like this would certainly be in those veins. I think there are other ways that you can involve students in disciplinary research that might also require certain digital skills. So we're happy to consult. There's the link if you want to apply, if you happen to be at Bryn Mawr. Sorry. So I think that's our pretty much our prepared content. If you guys have questions or are interested in certain facets, we are happy to talk. I guess I won't stop this just in case.
Two questions. First off, were they limited to Unity, or were they able to explore other possibilities?
So good question. So basically, and I'm gonna just stand here so that we can capture the mic a little bit better. Basically what we, since we were familiar with Unity, having had these internships before and seeing our students use that through developing for the HoloLens, we were pretty familiar in terms of how Unity looked and sort of how it worked and its capabilities for the HoloLens in particular. What's useful also about Unity is it can apply to many different platforms, so both the cardboard and the HoloLens actually can be developed through Unity.
And
So,
ARKit for
and
iOS.
yes. So we did sort of do a preliminary exploration before we were planning the course, and we thought, let's look at all of the other things that are out there, whether those are AR/VR technologies or software programs or sort of independent standalone apps that allow you to sort of use AR or VR. So we essentially came to the conclusion that Unity was probably the best one to use because it's got a lot more documentation, relatively speaking, and because of the versatility of the sort of platforms that you can build for through Unity, we decided to stick with it.
You can actually use other things to develop for other devices. There are other sort of, Unity's billing itself as a software development environment. And one of the advantages it allows you to do is also do graphic work and some things like that inside of it. So there are other development kits, development environments that one could use. This just seemed to be the one that worked best and easiest for most people, so we went with that.
I will also say one con of Unity is that it updates very, very frequently. So when we offer, I think, to give you an idea, I downloaded Unity for the first time in like October 2016, and by December 2016 there was a new version. By June 2017 there was another update to Unity. I think there's been 2 or 3 more in between. So
and pretty major updates, I would
pretty
say.
yeah, like
not,
to the point
not
that,
just tweaking.
yeah, like to the point that like sometimes the documentation isn't the same as what actually exists in the newest version of Unity. So that's, take it as you will. And you said you had a second question?
The second question was when students began to conceptualize ideas and things that they were going to create, were they very lofty at first? Did you have to dumb it down to a certain extent? Or did you find that most people were pretty realistic in what they proposed?
Yes, is a short answer.
Yes. We actually, well, first of all, I was to say that for their projects, we gave them the option of seeing something all the way through to completion or being very lofty and conceptual and just having sort of really good arguments for what they wanted to do and why. So like really well sort of intellectually grounded idea, plan for an exhibit that didn't quite come to fruition. So we did offer that possibility, and then...
No, I was just going to say, so basically at the end of the semester, we're not telling them you must have a completed app to get a good grade. We're telling them you must have either a completed app or a very thorough sort of plan for an app to get a good grade.
And you must have criteria for success, and you must meet your criteria for success. And so part of the learning process has been, wow, I picked up something that was way too big, and how do I sort of, and so one of the things we've been working with them, I think, is sort of thinking through, okay, you have this big idea, what's a small thing that you can test and just make sure like things could port to your device, which they were just grappling with. That was their assignment for the end of this latest block, is to make sure that they were able to get whatever sort of very drafty thing they have onto their device. And they discovered that, hey, that's not very easy. And we knew that just from past students' experiences. So we were telling them, you don't want to learn this at the last minute, right? You want to make sure that you get it. And so I would say there was a balance. Some students started relatively conservatively and then are building, and then some students started really sort of big picture and sort of had to kind of winnow their way down to a more reasonable process.
So like to give you an example, I guess, one of our groups is working on, I was mentioning this before, like a scavenger hunt. And basically the idea is that you are in a room and you see a bunch of boxes and you have to find the gold box. So concept is kind of like a scavenger hunt. You just try and find the gold box. So I think their initial idea was to have multiple levels and multiple gold boxes, and each of the gold boxes would have like an artifact or an object inside of them. And so to speak to the scaling down, they've sort of scaled it down to one level where they have a gold box, and right now they're currently testing to make sure that you can reach that gold box, especially as the room is entirely randomly generated every single iteration that they've that it sort of is played. So they scaled it down to that, and now they're sort of building up from there and saying, okay, now how do we incorporate the next thing, and how do we incorporate a little bit more of an intuitive user experience, for example. So let's go like
and
that.
what's interesting in that, I think, is that they picked up on scavenger hunt's a classic thing if you've gone to a museum as a kid, right? Anytime in the last, I would say last century, but even century before, you probably did a scavenger hunt with a worksheet, right? And so they were sort of riffing off of that and thinking, well, what does that look like in the virtual world, and what's the role of that? And so another thing we'll keep, and we haven't been doing that as much, I think, this past couple of weeks, because we've really been doing sort of, is it working? But is, how is this grappling with what museums, exhibitions, cultural institutions, how does this connect with the big questions of the course, which is what are museums and cultural institutions doing with this and why? What should they be doing? What do they think they should be doing? Those kinds of things. So we'll get them to keep articulating those things as they go.
And one way that they're doing that, which I don't think we mentioned earlier, was that each student is required to have a project research log. So basically we try and encourage them, like, every day you're doing field work, but obviously sometimes that doesn't happen. But typically like every week or so, our students will write a blog post that's visible only to them and is sort of a like kind of a general gist of what they've accomplished in the week, you know, what their pitfalls were, what discoveries and breakthroughs they made, so that they can kind of keep track for themselves, about just like what has happened in the past week and what do I maybe need to know or what can I look back at. So that's also been a really good gauge in terms of having our students being able to articulate what you know they've learned in the past week or the past month. And they can go, oh well, 2 weeks ago I didn't have a working model and now here it is. So I've got one. So that's
Yeah.
also something. Yeah. Any other questions?
I was curious about if you found that one technology was better, or it has been a sort of at a different level than the others, or if there's.
So speaking of what I've seen from our students' projects, I think they both present their own. So they both have their own like advantages and disadvantages. I think for us, the advantage of using the HoloLens is that we're a little bit more familiar with the sort of development process. But our groups that are using the HoloLens, there's one group of 1 and one group of 2 students, whereas our group that's using the cardboard is actually the remaining 3 students. So what we might not know in terms of developing for the cardboard, our group of 3 has sort of become a power team in terms of like figuring out, you know, oh, I'll do this and you can do that and we'll test this and, you know, make a plan of action. So I think they're kind of just doing their own thing and it's working out great.
I would say, and they're really, the biggest limitation that we found is even though Unity was designed to make it easier to develop games specifically, but for multiple platforms, right? So the idea is you can, rather than having to develop your computer game and then port it to PS Station, you know, I don't know, 4 years later or something, it wasn't ever that long, but, you know, a year later, and then maybe to a mobile version a year after that, this is a device where you can sort of start developing all of the same things and then make builds for different devices. It's actually very device specific. So for example, the students developing for the HoloLens have to have a Windows 10 computer that is unlocked. The students that are developing for Google Cardboard could use Windows or Macs. The ones who gravitated to that had Macs. So they said, well, you know, I don't really have access, or it's not as easy to get access to a Windows 10 computer. I want to work on my own computer. I'm going to use the Macs. And so then they're using ARKit. And, you know, I don't know. It's also new that it's hard to say that one's more developed than the other in some ways. I think it's just you're on different forums trying to figure out what's working and what's not working.
It's really like comparing apples to oranges, I think, because
or
like,
apples to Windows, but yes.
Sorry. Light of the night. Yeah, no, definitely, because like for example, the HoloLens allows you to see reality, but also virtual objects, whereas the cardboard lets you only see, you know, in an isolated environment. Cardboard is much cheaper than the HoloLens, so like you're just comparing them on 2 very drastically different levels, even though that's development software is the same.
What does ARKit accomplish?
That is Apple's AR tool and technology. So
Right.
essentially the ability for iPhones or so any Apple device, tablet or phone that's like the iPhone 6 or later, I think. So you have that it has to be, you know, relatively more up to date. It allows you to build AR apps. So if you imagine like Pokemon Go is a very classic example that allows you to sort of catch Pokemon in real life, looking at your surroundings. It allows you to just do essentially the same thing where you're able to build AR apps in it.
But it apparently is needed for the Google Cardboard, just the 3D modeling and things like that. Like it puts that, I think, element in that wasn't there before.
There's another app called Aris. Aris.
I know there's ARIS.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So yeah.
I worked with a faculty member at Haverford to put together a project, and Brett Mulligan did a. He does the Haver Athens, which is like an exploration of Haverford's campus, and exploring ancient Greece through different structures. And so it was initially just on paper, and he did it for many years. And with the help of a student worker last summer, I kind of helped some of the conceptualization in the beginning, and then the student worker kind of took over and did a lot of the work
Uh-huh.
bringing all the content into the app, and from what I heard from him, it was very successful. He may actually talk about it at our Teaching with Technology Forum later.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
That last time.
Yeah. And we had a
Did he talk about it at the?
Yeah, I remember.
Or he presented on two things, I think.
Yeah.
Because Brett talked about also. Oh, he did both. Yes. Okay, he did already talk about it.
maybe he will again. An
Yes.
update. We also presented them with, I think we talked about Eros. We had talked to them about like some of the location, like beacons and things like this. So geolocating things, geocaching, you know, and we talked to them a bit about Erasma and showed them, or it's now HP Reveal, I think, which is sort of you put your phone over something. You've got some multimedia content, but it's attached to an image. And so people are using it in museums, I think, especially to, like, say there's a portrait and you know, put your phone over the portrait, it recognizes the picture and then it does something, it launches something. So we showed them a couple of options, some of which, like that one particularly, would require no coding. It's just you produce a sort of multimedia thing that gets launched. But these guys were so interested in the AR VR. That was like what they wanted to do. So we didn't, but we did. We were thinking, you know, well, what if we get a bunch of students who have absolutely no coding experience, are totally daunted by the idea of developing some. So.
Because I think the cap for the course was like 15 students, so we were prepared to take that many, but we only had 6, which I think has worked out nicely in terms of keeping our sanities.
Yes. Yes.
Another question.
Yep.
I was wondering how this like ties in sort of overall. I don't know that much about the Praxis program, and it's kind of how it ties into the overall goals, and then kind of how it compares to some of the other sorts of things that people do. Is this a kind of oddball, or is it?
It's very different from our other Praxis courses. It's very different from our other Praxis courses in a number of ways. So if you think about, if we just compare to other Praxis seminar courses, generally speaking, you know, when Jenny went through the slide that gave you the 3 options, the external internships is really what the other Praxis seminar courses we're working with this semester are tied to. So you have a faculty advisor who, for example, talking about social justice and social activism, and all of the students in that seminar course are in field placements related to law and social policy or human services type organizations, and so they're spending their time off campus with a field site supervisor who may or may not be very closely aligned with the faculty advisor for the course, who's sharing information different from the way that Palak and Jenny are sharing information. As they mentioned, they have had the opportunity to kind of grow and learn the different programming and things with the students, and can have a much more direct impact on the experience than we can with a traditional Praxis seminar course. Typically, you know, if you look at the mission statement of Praxis, it's talking about kind of a reciprocal relationship with the community partner. And so the community partner is different in this sense because it's a campus community partnership. And so one of the questions that I've gotten, or one of the questions that I've been kind of pushed or pressed with, is related to kind of how this aligns with the social justice ethic, or this deeper community involvement. And the way that I think about it is more broadly in the context of Lilac, which is really thinking about the many different ways that students can get out and learn in the community, and what that could look like, and the many different things that the students in this course are being exposed to that they wouldn't be exposed to in a traditional Praxis seminar. But also that the educational technology and what it can be used for can very well support a social justice ethic or mission, and that these issues are coming up in the conversations in the course. We went to the Franklin Institute. I could name about 100 different times. Susan, you know, said, think about this, think about that. This is the real issue that we're kind of grappling with, and these are the people who are trying to access the museum. If we do this, then they won't be able to access it in the same way, or access it at all. So it looks very different, but I see it just as part of an evolving model. I don't know if that answers your question.
It's also interesting too because there has been a lot of talk around in various disciplines. I would say sociology is one of them, but also within the sort of nonprofit organization, NGO world around empathy and virtual reality experiences and virtual reality for social justice. And so having people go through the experience or a simulated experience of, say, living in a refugee camp and how that might color their either intention to donate or their thinking about who these people are and things like that. And so one of the units we'll get to a little bit later in the thing is looking at some of the different ways. Another one is using these kinds of technologies to recreate or create things that may be lost, things that have been lost, or recreate or preserve in some ways versions of things that or things that we can't experience the way they were at a past time because of development or loss and things like that. So some interesting social justice questions that are connected. Also, what was really nice about the Franklin Institute, I think, is they are a science museum, and so they were interested in augmented and virtual reality technology not only as a means of showing things or creating experiences for people, but also they too had the mission of let us allow people in the community to experience this technology to kind of remove that technological divide, right? The sort of, where are people going to get access to something like a Vive, if not a museum? And so another section coming up is thinking through that, what is the mission of a museum or a cultural institution in the 21st century where there are people who know how to do this and people who don't, kind of thing. Other questions? Bev? Okay. Cool. All right. Well, thank you guys. It was good to see you all again. I suppose anyone has a AA battery.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Apparently no. Even though it was fine.
Yikes.
Oh, really? Well, maybe it's not in. No, it's in correctly.
Is it on?
It was on. Let's see if it'll work now. I know. I turned it off just to open it.
Oh, okay, fair enough.